Hey everybody, Who's Your Jedi here with another review for you. This time I'm talking about episodes 11 and 12 of the Legend of Korra, called Skeletons in the Closet and Endgame respectively. Well folks, this was certainly on par with the season finales we got on the original show. It was epic, there were funny moments, there was lots of exciting action, just great stuff going on everywhere. If there are any doubts lingering for folks out there as to whether or not this show was a worthy successor of the original, I think they've safely been put to rest here. But anyway, let's get right into things and start talking about the characters. And of course, our first one that I want to talk about is Amon, or Nautok, as he is was born. But just for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to continue to call him Amon. So we've learned in the first episode, in episode 11, his origin. He's Yakon's son. He's Tarlok's brother. He's this bloodbending prodigy. You've been using a form of bloodbending to take everybody's bending away. So anyway, let's dive right into this. Now, one thing that we learned very early on when this show was in production was that Korra was going to be designed to be, in a lot of ways, the anti-Aang. And looking at it here, I think we can say that in what I think is really actually a very smart move, they had ultimately designed Korra's main opponent for this season to be the Anti-Katara. And let me explain my reasoning on that. Well, first of all, Yakon in episode 11 flat out says that Katara is the person who made it so that bloodbending was made illegal. So really, he personally blames Katara, not probably maybe just as much as Aang, for his downfall in life. And later on, we also do see him go up to the Northern Water Tribe to begin his new life after he gets his plastic surgery and all that. Now, it's never said whether he was originally from the Northern Water Tribe and he just went to a different town to start over. But this is just my personal impression, the way Tarlok told that story, I kind of got the impression that he would ultimately have been from the Southern Water Tribe. And if that is the case, well, then having someone from the Southern Water Tribe be Korra's opponent, seeing as how both she and Katara are Southern Water Tribe, well, there's more than a little bit of irony there. Also continuing on, if we do this thing, then Yakon married a Northern Water Tribe woman who, in what I'm sure is absolutely in no way, shape, or form a coincidence, had a look that was very reminiscent of Katara. She had the hair loopies, again, a slightly different style, but it certainly was hard not to look at that character, who I don't think she even got a name other than, Tarlok and Amon's mom, looked an awful lot like Katara. But if we look at that, and we also assume that I am correct that Yakon was Southern Water Tribe, that would also make Amon and Tarlok of mixed Water Tribe ancestry, just like Katara. Remember, Katara's grandmother was originally Northern Water Tribe. And, of course, a lot of that is Katara, of course, had a brother, but, that's a fairly small thing there. But anyway, continuing on with the whole Anti-Katara thing. Okay, hang on a second. I lost my train of thought there. Okay, well, actually, let me take a step back away from that and point out another sort of coincidence here that not only parallels Katara, but also parallels characters from the original series. And this is in relation to Tarlok and Amon, as they have parallel to Azula and Zuko. Now, when we see him in his younger days, Tarlok is very reminiscent of early Zuko. He's basically a good, happy kid. He doesn't want to hurt anybody, but he has this very harsh, uncaring father who's more interested in his sibling, who is the real prodigy of the family. And when the sibling, Tarlok ultimately takes a stand against his father. Meanwhile, Zuko, he just made a mistake. But this mistake is ultimately what just completely and utterly destroyed both Zuko and Tarlok's relationships with their fathers. Now, on the flip side of all of this, Zula completely embraced everything that her father was telling her, and of course he ended up embracing her as his favorite heir. Amon is basically what we would have gotten if Azula had turned on Ozai for whatever reason. So again, I like how they are taking these little elements from the previous series, aspects of characters that we are familiar with, and switching them around, mixing them up in new and interesting ways. And this ultimately gives us these new and interesting characters. And anyway, but to step back and talk a little bit more about the parallels between Amon and Katara, we are told that Katara is a waterbending prodigy. She is, I think, was even called in the show the greatest waterbender of her generation. And again, we do see the word prodigy used again in terms of Amon. Now, it's not, they don't say of his generation, but given that he was able to come up with a completely new use for waterbending, or I guess I should say bloodbending, well, he certainly would rank up there in terms of benders with Toph, in terms of just innovation and things like that. So again, we do see another parallel between him and Katara. But let's continue on with what happens with Amon. Of course, Korra does eventually learn the truth from Tarlok, and it's crafty guy that he is, even when the Korra is literally shouting the truth to him, he is still at the crowd. He is able to take this and use it as a weapon against her. He takes off his mask and he's got that makeup on that nobody knows it at the time, and is basically able to completely destroy Korra's credibility. And Korra, in what was correct, she was saying something very smart when she said, if we can expose Amon as a bender, then we will completely take away his greatest power. And of course, by his greatest power, she means his followers. And to a greater extent, it's not just his greatest power is that he has a large army of people who follow him, that he has all this technology. It is that Amon has what is perceived as moral authority. Now, I'm not going to go too far down this path because it's a complicated thing. But basically, the real power that Amon has is that he has the ability to make what he is doing seem right, to make it seem justified to the people. However, if Korra is able to expose him as a liar and a hypocrite, well then that evaporates. His power, his base, the people he draws his strength from are going to, of course, abandon him. And then he's just another very dangerous bender that can be dealt with. So anyway, we of course do see him use his bending, his blood bending, to take away all of Korra's bending, except for her air bending, which she just discovers during the middle of their big fight at the end of it all. Well, raise your hand if you saw that coming. But, just because you see something coming a long way down the way in a story, that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. Honestly, this can actually be good because it gives you that sense of anticipation, that wanting to see that moment. Now, this is, and really, why are sometimes, let me try that again. A lot of the times, this is completely uncommon. Like if we go in and watch a movie, well, 95% of the time, there's going to be a big battle between the hero and the villain at the end, and ultimately the hero is going to triumph. And if that doesn't happen for whatever reason, we're either genuinely surprised or we'll bash the movie, whatever. But what I'm saying is, it can be, even if it is something that is expected, is something that we do see a long way around the way, if the story is told in a good way, then that moment can really be a highlight of the series because it is something that we have been waiting for, anticipating, and if it is delivered in a way that is solid, that makes sense, and is earned by the plot, then it's really an asset to the story and not a hindrance. But anyway, we do see finally Korra getting to dish out some airbending, and, well, for somebody who's struggled for it with it as long as she has, looks like she's off to a pretty good start as an airbender. But then ultimately, during it all, we see that Amon is knocked into the water. His makeup comes off, and he busts out of the water in a display of a water spout, extremely reminiscent of Korra. Again, sort of showing us the parallels between the two of them. And the crowd sees that the scar is just makeup. He's exposed as a big hypocrite, and as I said, they immediately turn upon him. And Amon, robbed of that, simply runs away. Because as I said, without that moral authority, without the backing of the people, he's just another... I mean, he's a very powerful and dangerous bender, but he's just one guy. And it's even like the lieutenant says to him during their just before their fight that he's dedicated his entire... I mean, he even says, "I've dedicated my life to you." And then Amon, well, it's not made perfectly clear, but it's heavily implied that Amon just flat out kills him. And I think that scene was there, one, to sort of tie up the loose end of what happens to the lieutenant, but to show us that yes, if Amon is exposed as a waterbender, as a hypocrite, then his support, his power, will indeed be stripped of him. Just in the same way that he had been going around stripping other people of their bending. Except that Amon was going around and using lies and, bending to do these terrible things, while it is ultimately truth that is able to rob him of his real power. But anyway, kind of continuing on with talking about Amon, let's move over and talk about Tarlok. I was honestly floored by what we saw in episode 11. Tarlok was genuinely very repentant for what he had done. He even flat out apologizes to Korra with 100% genuine sincerity for what he had done to her. And remember, this was just an episode or two ago where he was basically had kidnapped her and locked her in a box, possibly to die of thirst. But here it is. He's the broken man. He's had his bending taken away from him by his own brother, the one person in the world who, as we see, Tarlok ultimately cares about still. And it is that betrayal, really, by his brother that ultimately opens his eyes to how he's just gone down the same dark path that his father really wanted him to go down. Not in terms of, striking back at benders or anything like that. In fact, Tarlok's whole thing, his whole driving force in life, was really to keep benders on top, to be the exact opposite of everything that his father wanted him to be. And I can't really help but think that that's not a coincidence. But by what I'm talking about here is that he did go down his father's path of using people, of hurting them, of manipulating them. Bribery, blackmail, kidnapping, assault, all these horrible things that Tarlok did, he did because of the path his father set him on as a child. Now, this is not an excuse, of course. His father did indeed set him on that path, but it was Tarlok who chose to continue going down on this. And incidentally, if you think that I'm maybe lifting a little bit from the conversation between Darth Revan and Darth Malak in the original Knights of the Old Republic game, you would not be wrong. But anyway, excuse me a sec. At the end of it all, after he's been exposed, it is Tarlok that Amon returns to. And again, showing this other side to both him and his brother, Amon apologizes to Tarlok for what he has done. and asks him to come with him. He even says to Tarlok and that his brother is all that he has left in this world. And Tarlok doesn't say it, but it's very clear that his feelings are the same. Which ultimately leads us to what happens at the very end with Tarlok and Amon. And I'm sure a lot of people are just wondering, well, why didn't Tarlok and Amon just go off together and start new lives somewhere? Well, honestly, I think Tarlok's reasoning on what it was is he and his brother had just done so much wrong in the world that really just going off somewhere and living quietly for the rest of their days, that really wouldn't do anything to balance the scales. And remember, the Avatar world is all about balance. It really would be a very unbalanced thing for them in some way to not pay for their crimes. Now granted, Tarlok did indeed have his bending taken away from him. But there's the question is, okay, what happens if they do this? Is it so unreasonable to think that they might not ultimately have families of their own? Well, hey, if Yukon can do it. But if that does happen, then what are the chances that even inadvertently that they would pass down the wrong messages to their children and then ultimately just continue propagating a terrible cycle? Now, sure, maybe they would do it right, but maybe they wouldn't. It's sort of like if you've seen people who are some people who are abused as children or who have really cruel and terrible parents. They're afraid of having children of their own for fear that they might turn into those cruel and uncaring parents that they had. Now, fortunately for us, fortunately for everybody, the majority of kids like that who have the moral compass intact to even think that way, they don't repeat those mistakes of their parents. They go and they of course make mistakes as parents do, but they ultimately do not go down that dark path. And they raise, mostly good, decent kids. But as I was saying, I just think that Tarlok really doesn't see that as a possibility for him and his brother. I think he sees them as just damaged goods, as people who have gone too far, and that ultimately as men who had to pay for what they had done. And while Tarlok really did have nothing left, Amon still had his bending. And if Amon still had that power to take away the bending from others, well, as long as that knowledge is in the world, there's the possibility that it could spread, that someday in the future there could be another Amon. And I think to Tarlok, that is just unacceptable. I think that given the circumstances, ending his life and going on to whatever comes next with his brother, once again as the brother he knew and loved and remembered, as someone who was able to show goodness and caring and compassion, at least to a small degree at the very end. I think that is where Tarlok knew this is as much redemption as either of us is ever going to be able to find in this world. It's time for us to see what happens in the next. But that's just my personal take on things. So let's move on and talk about the rest of the cast. Not really a whole lot to say about what was going on with Bolin in this episode. It was sort of interesting to see that Iroh specifically asked him if he was a metal bender. And and do remember, in my last video, I kind of speculated that maybe next season one thing that we might see is Lin teaching Bolin metal bending. Now, if you have to think, given his qualifications and given the amount of bending that we've seen him do, Bolin would actually be a pretty good choice to be recruited into the metal bending police. He's certainly an extremely skilled earthbender. He's ultimately a good and very moral guy, and he has that strong connection with Korra. So there are, I do think, a great many pros to having him join the Metalmending Police, or at the very least getting some training in it from Lin. Now that Lin gets her bending back, well, he's got basically about the best earthbending teacher he could ever hope for right there. So, since I mentioned him just a second ago, let's briefly talk about Iroh. We don't really get to see a huge amount of him personality-wise, but it really was nice to get him to say things like, "My grandfather would have trusted the Avatar's instincts, so I will too." Obviously being a reference to Zuko. And just looking at the way Iroh carries himself, it's very obvious that a lot of Zuko has rubbed off on him. In the way that, of course, the original Iroh rubbed off a great deal on Zuko. And one way or anything, let me try that again. And you can definitely see that the skill in firebending in the royal family has not diminished in the least. Iroh is doing a lot of really great stuff. I mean, he's able to take out a freaking, I guess, missile for lack of a better word with firebending. He's also able to, just like Azula, able to use firebending to fly. Now, granted, if I remember correctly, she was able to use the blue lightning to fly, while he can only use regular fire. But still, I mean, Iroh was just zipping around from plane to plane all over the place, using firebending in a way that reminded me, actually, especially given the outfit that he was wearing, an awful lot of the Rocketeer. And incidentally, if you've never seen that movie, go and watch it. It is a fantastic, fantastic movie. I love the Rocketeer. But anyway, so we do get to see quite a bit of, Iroh kicking some butt, single-handedly taking out airplanes. He, like Lin, has no fear about jumping out of planes and going from one place to the other, and just really demonstrating to us that he is indeed quite the formidable character in terms of firebending. And I can't help but think that this was probably not done just for the sake of, hey, that's cool. I honestly do think that we are going to be seeing more of Iroh as a character in the next season. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later on. So let's move on to talk about Mako. Well, the big thing with Mako here is that ultimately he and Korra do get together. And I have some genuinely mixed feelings about this. Ultimately, at the end, I was kind of happy for Mako and Korra. There had been, obviously, that attraction between them for a very long time. Mako was obviously, despite his relationship with Asami, conflicted about it. But, and this is something I mentioned earlier, how if I felt that if Korra and Mako had just sort of said, screw it, and just gotten together, just like that they'd sort of be doing a disservice to Asami as a friend. And I do think that the writers attempted to address that. They do see Mako go to Asami and apologize to her. As I had said in my earlier videos, Mako is genuinely guilty of being kind of a bad boyfriend lately. And while no words are really said between them to that effect, Asami's reaction to it all basically did emotionally ring very strongly of, we're breaking up. Again, it's not really said, but I think that the emotional notes of it were there. And I do think that Mako did pick up on that, which ultimately I think is one of the reasons why he was able to let Korra know how he feels. Now, that said, we are still going to be looking at a situation where we don't know exactly how much time happens between Amon fleeing and the final scene where they do get together, but it's safe to say maybe a couple of days have passed, at least a day or two has passed. So that still doesn't change the fact that after more or less, even if there were not the words there, breaking up with Asami, that Mako and Korra got together literally within just a couple of days of him and Asami breaking up, which I gotta say, folks, I understand that they've been through a lot emotionally, and the drama that comes with relationships may seem, in those circumstances, a very trivial thing. But again, I still feel that they're being a little unkind to Asami in that regard. And I can't help but think that there's probably going to be a rather awkward conversation, and maybe even a rather a confrontation with some heated words in regards to this happening early on next season. But that's next season. Let's talk about the other big thing with Mako, is that we see that and this is something I admit I did not completely see coming at all. It is Mako who is ultimately the one who is able to, at first, really genuinely strike back at Amon and fight Amon on his own level. And remember, Mako is just a firebender. He is not the Avatar. He's just a guy. However, and this is acknowledged even by Amon, that Mako is an extraordinarily talented firebender. He's able to pull that, shooting electricity into Amon while he's being bloodbended. I mean, that's something I don't think we've seen anyone do anything remotely like that. Which, as I said, just really goes to show how talented Mako is. And as I speculated in one of my earlier videos, we now have Iroh around, someone who has to be almost unquestionably one of the greatest firebenders in the world. And again, having Lin, one of the greatest earthbenders in the world, hanging around, and having Bolin, an extremely talented earthbender. Well, I know I'm speculating here, but I mean, come on. But anyway, that's for next season. But let's talk, of course, about our title character, about Korra herself. And so much happens with Korra here in these episodes, it's really hard to know where to start. But I guess I should talk about how Korra has changed mentally. And I'm not talking spiritually. We'll get to that. Let's look at how Korra was in her early episodes. I think, in fact, I even said in my first review of the first 2 episodes that Korra is a tank. That is her approach to life. She just takes something and she charges it head on. And as we see in this episode, Korra still has that drive in her. However, she's had enough experience that she's come to realize that simply is not a workable solution to every problem in life. She is able to understand why attacking Amon's guys head-on is an extremely bad idea. She is able to realize and strategize as to how exposing Amon as a liar, as a hypocrite, will be able to rob him of his power far more effectively than just going out there and trying to beat him up in front of all of his followers. So Korra has, despite herself, and maybe not even realizing it, learned, of all things, patience. She's learned a little bit of strategy. She's learned how to think to solve her problems. Now, granted, I don't think that we still aren't going to see Korra being headstrong and occasionally charging into situations where she probably would have had a better result if she'd stopped to think things out more clearly in the future. I don't think that we're never going to see her do something like that because, well, even very level-headed people sometimes let their emotions get the better of them. But again, Korra's very young. But she is also at that age where you start to temper your passion with a little bit of experience, with a little bit of reality. She's at that age where she's really starting to understand that drive, that passion just simply isn't enough all the time. And since I did speak about how Yukon influenced his sons and how Iroh had influenced Zuko, with that patience, we see how Tenzin has influenced Korra. And I love how Tenzin's name is never even mentioned. It is just through her bond with him and through her own character growth, as we've seen across the season, that we realize that influence, that seed that Tenzin has planted within her. Ooh, boy, that sounded unintentionally dirty. Yeah. Okay, so let's skip. Let's that. Anyway, what Tenzin's training has ultimately blossomed within Korra, and it's not just with the airbending. It is with the patience, with the spiritual side of the air nomads, the spiritual side that had so been holding Korra back, and she is able to finally find it. And of course, we do get to finally see Korra enter the Avatar state. And one thing I liked, and this is something I was a little worried about, to be honest, is that it didn't happen when Amon was trying to take away her bending. It happened when he was trying to take away Mako's bending. And again, this fits with what we have seen with the Avatar state. Almost always, I mean, let me take that back a little bit. Most of the time, when Aang entered the Avatar state in a way that was not deliberate, it was because of something happening to people that he cared about. He flies when he goes to the back home to the air temple for the first time and sees Gyatso's body, the body of the man who was essentially his father. That's when he flips out and enters the Avatar state. When Appa is stolen from him by the Sandbenders, he freaks out and enters the Avatar state. And I'm honestly glad that they didn't do it. First, because seeing Korra's bending taken from her made for some extremely dramatic, extremely good storytelling, and it did open things up to what we did see with the other avatars at the very beginning. But the main reason I was afraid that they might go that route was basically I was afraid that they would try and use the Avatar state as God mode, which, okay, basically is what it is in a lot of ways. But in terms of drama, in terms of storytelling, in terms of what the characters demand, that would have been a humongous cheat. Korra had to face and defeat and deal with Amon as Korra. That is what needed to happen, and that is ultimately what happened, and the story is infinitely better for it. And of course, we do at the very end get to see that Korra, amazingly enough, in her despair of all things, is able to reach the state where she can connect with her previous incarnations fully. And again, it is here, it is in that connection, in that spiritual side of herself, that thing that she has so struggled with, that thing that she has struggled with more than anything in her entire life. Once she has found that, it is that is able to restore her. It is that which is able to bring balance to Korra. And it is that which allows her to enter the Avatar state and truly, for the first time, be Avatar Korra. And I just have to say that scene, that really was beautiful. I have no other words for it. It was, of course, in terms of acting and writing and the music and just the visuals, just beautiful. It was it was everything that it needed to be. Yeah, that really is all I can say about that. It was what it needed to be, and I don't think I could have asked for anything more from that scene. So anyway, let's excuse me a sec. Let's let's start talking a little bit more about the plot episodes aspects of things. My first main thing with the plot is let's talk about Amon briefly. And here we get to see more of his ultimate master plan. Of course, we continue to see his fond habit of slapping pictures of himself all over everything. And while we have, I guess, ultimately settled on to my mild disappointment, just because it's such a cliche, the Nazis as the main parallel to the Equalists. What we see with Amon slapping his face everywhere is extremely highly reminiscent of guys like Saddam Hussein and Kim Jong Il and Mao Zedong, and uh, and you know what, folks? I've actually been to China, and it is honestly more than a little creepy just how common the pictures of Mao are everywhere. And especially if you go to basically any tourist website, you're going to have a bunch of Chinese peddlers come running up to you saying in English, Mao book, which is basically these little books of quotations from Chairman Mao translated into English that they like to try and hawk to the tourists. And of course, they also seem to like to hawk all kinds of other little knickknacks with the face of Chairman Mao on them. Something that I can't help but think that a guy who really wasn't a big fan of capitalism would have been extraordinarily unhappy about. But honestly, my read of history says that Chairman Mao was a humongous dick, so screw him and what he thinks. But anyway, let's move on. Let's talk about the actual combined forces, I think, united forces, something like that, the military. Now, when they're steaming into the harbor and there's no Equalist troops waiting to meet them on the ground, there's nothing in the air. I was a little disappointed that Iroh didn't immediately start thinking, okay, nothing in the air, nothing in the ground. I wonder if maybe there's something in the water. Now, come on, dude. Your grandfather was Zuko. I'm sure you learned about the Day of Black Sun in school as a kid. You know, where the united forces of the Water Tribe and the Earth Kingdom and the Avatar and all that other stuff attacked the Fire Nation capital from the sea using things from under the water. And remember, this is set in a parallel version of the 1920s, so given that submersibles had been around since at least the 1860s in our world, I'm going to assume that people in the Avatar world are not unfamiliar with the concept of submersibles. Now, granted, we've never seen them on the show, so I might be being a little unfair here. And also, again, to be completely fair to Iroh and the forces, the United Military, and I think it's even sort of mentioned by Bolin a little bit in these episodes, that the Equalists have Hiroshi Sato on their side, whose main job is to crank out all these crazy mechanical wonders that nobody has ever seen before. So if that's the case, then okay, I guess I should cut Iroh a little slack. But as I understand it, mines have existed since at least the First World War, possibly even before. I'm not really an expert on that sort of thing. So I can't help but think that, shouldn't he have suspected that something like that might happen? But again, we don't know if this technology existed previously in the Avatar world, or if this is something that's just completely new and that Hiroshi is the one that cooked it up. Now, again, I don't think it's fair to assume that just because in our world some technology existed prior to the 1920s, we don't to say that it must for sure exist in the world of Republic City. I just don't think that's fair. Now, I can say I think it's likely that that technology should exist, but I would be unfair of me to say the show is wrong or Iroh is dumb for not knowing or considering this just because that technology existed in the real world. But anyway, yeah, I really just think that he should have like, okay, nothing in the air, nothing on the ground. I should be expecting attack from the sea. But moving on, so we get to see the return of the hobo, and if he has a name beyond that, I'm sorry, I don't know what it is. It might have been mentioned somewhere on the official website or something like that, but I don't read the official website, so I'm just going to refer to him as the hobo. So we get to see the hobo again. I was rather happy about that. I think he's a fun character. I don't think he needs to turn up every episode, but I'd be all right with him popping up from time to time to help Team Avatar out. He's certainly quite a very entertaining character, and his hobo stew and Asami's reaction to it did provide us with a very, very nice, humorous moment in the midst of some very intense stuff. But I have to say, not only having the hobo town have a telegraph line, but having the hobo himself apparently be fluent in the Avatar world's version of Morse code sure is an awful handy coincidence, isn't it? I mean, wow, what are the odds of finding a hobo with access to a telegraph who also is fluent in Morse code? Gee, I mean, what else do those hobos have going on down there? I mean, is there like a secret hobo Manhattan project in the back? Whew. Oh, boy, Republic City better hope that hobos don't get access to atomic weapons. That would probably be rather bad. But anyway, let me see here. Yes, let's move on to another rather questionable storytelling moment. Now we get to see Asami and Bolin and Iroh taken out by the electric fence, which is what I'm going to call it since that's basically what it is. And they're of course rescued by Naga and Pabu. Okay, question. How did Naga and Pabu get through the electric fence without getting shocked themselves? Now, granted, it's not exactly vital to the story that we know this. I mean, honestly, we just don't know how high a polar bear dog can jump. So if Naga was, say, able to smell the ozone or some such thing from the fence, she might have just been smart enough to just jump over the thing. Or maybe she even saw what happened to the others, and that's how she knew to come to the rescue. But it's something that did cross my mind. On the other hand, it's not something that's really vital. It is not absolutely essential to the story that we be given this information. And given all the other things that they have to do in the 22 minutes that each of these episodes has to work with, I can't really fault the writers for skipping over that particular detail. Let me see. Speaking of the stuff that happened at the airbase, we get to see Asami fighting her own father. And here we see it's not just Amon and Tarlok who have parallels to Zuko. It's Asami herself. I mean, she is literally forced to fight her own father. And here, again, it's really a fight that the father instigates. And now, granted, I guess you could say the case that Asami started it by siding against her father, but we have seen that Asami is a morally sound person. She will not stand by and let people be victimized just because they're benders just because they are benders. She will not betray her friends just for she won't betray her friends just because her father is her father. She doesn't betray her friends because her father is on the morally wrong side. And then in all of this, we see ultimately Asami's father completely turn on her in the way that Ozai, simply because he made a mistake, because he stood up against sacrificing the lives of inexperienced troops, Ozai turned on Zuko. And here, because Asami refused to betray her friends, ultimately her father turns on her. And like Ozai, basically tries to destroy her. Now, granted, Ozai didn't kill Zuko, but he just figured him and cast him out with nothing but the clothes on his. Well, no, he did have that ship. I guess that's a little unfair. But now we don't know for sure if Hiroshi was going to kill Asami, but it sure looked like he might be willing to consider it. So here it is. Asami now has no father. But as we did see earlier, it looks like she's going to be staying at Air Temple Island for the foreseeable future. And is it possible that we might see Tenzin stepping in to fill that role? Well, it seems to have worked for Korra, and I could certainly see him doing that. On the other hand, if that happens, well, I could also see the sort of clash between two adopted daughters being a source of potential conflict for Tenzin. But again, that's something for next time. And let me see, what else do we have? Speaking of, let's take a moment to talk about Mako and their relationship. Mako and his relationship with Bolin. I do like how this has been, of course, a very underlying theme the whole season. And I do like that they did take a moment to show that, despite them having butted heads over Korra and all this other stuff this season, that Mako and Bolin do take that moment at the very end to basically say and make it completely clear that they do love each other. And I like the fact that they didn't skimp on the fact that they do say, I love you to each other. Because, we guys can sometimes be really bad about that, especially when it comes to our other male relatives. But life is short, and nobody is promised another day. So I think it is, especially under circumstances like what's going on with Mako and Bolin. So under those circumstances, I think it's perfectly in character for both of them to take that moment to show each other just how much they care. And one final really big gripe that I have here is that we don't have no idea how it was that the Equalists captured Tenzin and his family. And again, it's not really vital that we be told this, especially given that there's only 22 minutes to work with. But it just seems that not getting anything in that regard makes what happened with Lin in the last episode seem honestly like a waste. Lin ultimately almost sacrificed her life, and did sacrifice her bending for ultimately nothing. So I feel that was a bit of weak storytelling. Now, this is one thing that I have been meaning to do, and I just keep forgetting, is to take a moment to give a lot of credit to the voice actors. Janet Varney, J.K. Simmons, Seychelle Gabriel, all the other folks doing voice work on this show have just really done a phenomenal job. But the person that I want to give, honestly, the most credit to is David Faustino. Now, I said in my first episode, my reviews of episodes 1 and 2, that the only thing that I'd known David Faustino from before was his role as Bud Bundy on Married with Children. And I did say then that I thought he was doing a perfectly fine job as Mako, and I thought that he was going to continue to do a great job. And he did. He delivered Mako. He gave us everything we could have wanted in terms of acting for this character. So my opinion of David Faustino as an actor has really, really, really shot up quite a lot because of this. So hats off to you, man. I really hope we get to see more voice acting work from him in the future, because he really does seem to have a real talent for this. And I forgot to mention this over several episodes, is the voice of Adult Aang, and that is a guy by the name of D.B. Sweeney. And he's best known for starring as Chance Harper on a TV show called Strange Luck that aired for one season alongside the X-Files back in the 90s. And I was actually quite a fan of the show. I thought it was genuinely a very good programming. It just ultimately didn't catch on in the ratings and got the chop after a year. But I did become quite the fan of D.B. Sweeney, so I always got a real kick out of it whenever I see him on any TV show or in a movie. And I have to say, he also really delivers as Adult Aang. He, of course, doesn't sound anything like Aang did as a kid, but then, most of us, when we're adults, don't sound like we did when we were 12 years old, and, thank goodness for it. But he did play Aang really well. I have absolutely no complaints about that performance. And frankly, I was just glad to see the guy on the show. He's a good actor who, deserves more spotlight than he gets. So anyway, folks, overall, this is really just, I'm going to just say it. I really think that this is the best animated show on TV this season. And it's easily ranks up there with all the other television that's going on this season. The Legend of Korra, in terms of writing, in terms of art and acting and music and action and storytelling, is just plain good television. And Brian and Dante continue to not disappoint. They delivered, I think, really everything that we as fans of the original show could have wanted, and then some. And I also want to take a moment to thank everybody who's watched my reviews over the season. It's really, as best I can tell from the Korra fans, that I've gathered the vast majority of my subscribers. It's the show that's gotten me the most comments on my YouTube channel. So thank you, everybody who has tuned in, has commented, rated, subscribed, and who has also followed me on Twitter at Hoosier Jedi. So yeah, guys, it's been a lot of fun watching this season with you, sharing my opinions with you, and having conversations with you, my fellow fans, and of course, a big thank you to everybody who took the time to comment, rate, subscribe, who sent me messages, and as an especially big thank you to everybody who took the time to say to me that they enjoy my reviews, that they like the fact that I do like to focus in on the characters and the plot and those other things. The reason I started doing these reviews was, and I don't mean this as a knock on any of the other very good folks out there who review various TV shows on YouTube. It's just that I didn't see, these are things that I think about, that I want to talk about. And I just really wasn't able to find very many other reviewers out there on YouTube who were talking about those sort of things. And I've always been a believer that if you can't find what it is you want in terms of something like that, then you should go out there and try and be the one that makes it yourself. And from the reaction that I've gotten from all the folks out there on YouTube, it looks like I've been able to not only satisfy my own desire to be able to talk about these things with other fans, but that I've also gotten some people to think about things in different ways. I've exposed them to different ideas, things they may not have thought about before, and just really been able to reach out and tap other people who had felt the same way as I did. Now, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. I really hope I'm not coming across as egotistical in any way, shape, or form in saying that. Again, I'm just a guy giving my opinions of TV shows on the internet. It's really it's really nothing special ultimately at the end of the day. You know, in 100 years we'll all be dead and nobody's going to care what I thought about the latest episode of The Legend of Korra. But I do thank you all for taking the time out of your lives to listen to what it is that I have to say and taking the time out of your lives to let me know what it is you think. Um, the vast majority of comments and responses I've gotten from people have been interesting and thoughtful and all around wonderful. So once again, thank you to everyone who took the time to listen to me and to give some feedback. Well, anyway, folks, I've been rambling on for almost an hour here, so I think it's time to wrap things up. As always, please comment, rate, subscribe, and until next season, take care and have a good one.